Thank you so much for having us today. As mentioned, my name is Kimberly Greenleaf, and we are honored to be a part of such a great event each year as we continue to learn more as empowering women. As mentioned, we are Odyssey. I am the Senior Account Manager here in the Wilkes-Barre-Scranton market. You would likely know us as KRZ, Froggy 101, WILK News Radio, and Max 102.3. We are a leading full-service digital marketing company that specializes in the audio space. Our capabilities include traditional radio advertising, podcasting, digital audio, email marketing, social marketing, SEO, SEM, advanced target display, and so much more. And all with unmatched attribution and data analysis. I'm your local marketing expert with national capabilities and market-leading results, and we are a proud partner of the Scranton Chamber. And today, this one's good. See, I didn't even need my glasses for that. So big. Today, it's an honor to introduce Nicole Strauser. Nicole, Vice President, Beneficiary Fulfillment, has over 20 years of experience with Prudential. In her current role, Nicole is responsible for delivering final promises for group insurance, individual life insurance, annuities, and retirement customers. She has been focused on strengthening Prudential's operational discipline and empowering associates via ideation and customer obsession to transform our customer experience. Prior to her current role, Nicole held various roles across Prudential's retirement organization, including the contact center, client services, and all back office operations, from money in, money out to complex record keeping. Nicole holds a bachelor's degree in business administration from Marywood University. She is a Series 6, 99, and 26 registered principal. A lot. Nicole currently sits on the board for Leadership Northeast, a local nonprofit focused on creating servant leaders in the community. Nicole also serves as the Prudential Executive Site Lead for the Scranton office and the executive sponsor of the Scranton Pride Business Resource Group. And here is Nicole. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm excited to have all of you here today as we kick off our panel about managing conflict. I'm going to give the names of all of our lovely ladies up here ready to talk about managing conflict. And each of them is going to pause after I do their introductions. They're going to pause and tell a little bit about themselves and what they want to focus on when talking about conflict today. So we have attorney Marianne Gilmartin. We have Brittany Cesarini and Brooke Lipperini. Attorney Marianne, if you'd like to start.
Can you hear me? Yes, okay. That was not a good start. I had to manage some conflict there for a moment before we get started. So nice to see all of you. I think it's a little troubling that we have so many people attending a managing conflict program today. We must have a lot of conflict to manage. My name is Marianne Gilmartin. I'm an attorney in Scranton. I practice with the full-service law firm of Stevens & Lee. We have 180 lawyers, not that many in Scranton. Scranton's office is the smallest branch office. There are 5 of us there. And I'm a shareholder in the firm. I practice commercial litigation with an emphasis on complex construction and complex commercial litigation. I also represent public utilities and do some work with real estate litigation, particularly up in Wayne and Pike counties at Lake Wallenpaupack and in the Marcellus Shale region. But I think the reason I'm here today is because I also serve as an arbitrator for the American Arbitration Association. I resolve construction disputes, Pennsylvania and New Jersey predominantly. And I also am a trained federal mediator in the federal court system. So I have the advantage, it's really the best of both worlds. I get to practice the law that I love, but also administer disputes as part of that. And then I am the mother of 4 adult sons. I learned how to manage conflict very effectively. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. And then the grandmother of 5, 4 of whom are girls, so I got to skip a generation. And I'm really enjoying that period of my life.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for being here. It's so good to be here. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. My name is Brittany Cesarini. I am the Director of Communications at an organization called Global Health Corps. Global Health Corps is a leadership accelerator. Our work really centers on recruiting and training young leaders who are dedicated to health equity. And we span countries. So we work in New York City. We also work in Malawi, Rwanda, Uganda, and in Zambia. So our community and our staff is very diverse. And so the reason why I'm here today, and I'm excited to bring the lens of what does it look like to use communications to navigate conflict, and also to build a culture that can help us actually prevent it and get ahead of it across lines of difference. So it's a bit about me. My background is in policy and in advocacy, strategic communications. I am originally from this area, recently returned after a decade of living in East Africa and in New York City. And I have a 3-year-old son who has a lot of opinions, so we're always navigating conflict with him as well. Over to Brooke.
Thanks, Brittany. Hi, everyone. I'm Brooke Lipperini. I'm the Regional HR Manager for CanPack US. We are a manufacturer of aluminum beverage cans. I've been with CanPack since October of 2020 as the 3rd employee in the U.S. Prior to that, I've been in HR leadership roles my entire career, and a lot of what I do all day is managing one kind of conflict or another in the workplace. So I'm just curious, how many of you ladies have personally experienced a conflict in the workplace? Yeah. How many have helped manage a conflict in the workplace? Okay. Super. Okay, great. So I also live in Oliphant. I'm from Northeast PA. I've lived here my whole life. I grew up in Honesdale in Wayne County, and I moved far, far away to Oliphant, where I live with my fiance, 2 boys and 2 dogs, one of whom's a female. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for going into your background. Really appreciate that. As you can see, we have a wide span of experience and expertise. So I'm going to ask the first question, and then I'll pause and see if there's any questions in the audience. So if each of you could talk about what is the most recent example of conflict and how you had to manage that, let's say in the past quarter.
Okay, so I was actually thinking about this on my drive to the conference today, and I was kind of like, which story do I want to tell? Because there are so many. So the most recent one was a conflict in the workplace. And so there was a conflict on our manufacturing floor between 2 peer employees who had been kind of brewing. This conflict had been brewing for some time. They didn't like each other. Somebody said something. The other one says something back. And it became kind of like a daily thing where these 2 folks were, kind of going at it a little bit. And over time, it became a bigger conflict. And this conflict wound up turning into an actual altercation in the workplace. Somebody picked up an aluminum beverage can that was laying on the ground, threw it at the other one, and it went down on the manufacturing floor. And so, these things happen. Supervisor comes over, breaks it up. But the part that was really interesting about this was there was another employee who was there, another person who kind of watched it all happen and was so upset about this. And so when I think about how we handled this conflict in particular, it wasn't just about these 2 folks who lost it in the middle of the workday. Yes, we need to address that. This behavior is not acceptable. But this other bystander was really upset. And so I took some time and I sat down with her and I said, talk to me about how you feel about what you just saw. And she said, well, gosh, I kind of walked by this and I didn't know what to do. And so I went and screamed for help because, it was clearly turning into a really bad situation. And so I said, okay, great. You did the right thing. Thank you very much. And then I checked in with her the next day, right? How are you doing? And so talking about those experiences, whether they're in the workplace or not, and kind of how do we find an outlet for each other to talk about, maybe this just happened. How do we feel about it? How can we move forward from here to make sure that everyone feels respected in their space? So that was my latest and greatest.
I think I'll share about an instance that wasn't a full-blown conflict, but had the potential to be, and what happened in that situation. We have a relatively small team, so we are a staff of 26, as I mentioned, spread out across 5 countries. We have a pretty high-profile senior leadership team member join our team. So a relatively new hire. Became pretty clear early on that they were somewhat disgruntled. There was a misalignment of expectations of what the role would be and what the role was and what they thought it would be or hoped it would be. And so that person was not having direct conversations with their manager. They were talking to other junior staff members. There was a lot of speculation and sort of side conversations going around. And it got to a stage where this person decided that they were going to leave the organization. And again, it wasn't there wasn't a lot of clarity around that. They had just joined. There was a lot of work that went into the onboarding process. And so, as what I mentioned earlier, sort of taking a proactive approach to that, part of my role in overseeing internal communications is, hey, this is a situation. We're hearing the speculations, bringing this to my boss and saying, I really think we should get ahead of this, because if we have a disgruntled employee who is leaving, hasn't had the opportunity to share their concerns openly, there's much more of a likelihood that they would take to social media or other public-facing platforms and share or vent about their experience. And that's an opportunity for us instead to have an internal conversation, hear from them, and also learn from that experience so that we don't repeat those mistakes again. So we were able to have that conversation, able to show up for that employee in a way that they felt supported and moving on to take the next step and to come up with some messaging that felt, authentic and genuine to the situation around this just wasn't a good fit. And sometimes that happens. And also there are things for us to learn in terms of how we approach the hiring process for that position in the future. So that's one that comes to mind.
So my most recent conflict came up in a case that I was handling recently. It was a fast-paced piece of real estate litigation worth about $100 million with a very prominent local businessman on the other side who knew that he was going to have to be deposed as part of the litigation. And when the deposition began, it became clear that he was uncomfortable and felt threatened. And not that I'm threatening, I'm just doing my job, right? But he felt threatened nevertheless. Maybe it was the environment. And his method of answering my questions was to not answer my questions, but instead to glare at me across the table. And so after he did that once or twice, I decided that I would use the only tools that were available to me at the time and just create a record of what he was doing. Remember, this is a deposition. There are court reporters present, other lawyers present. So let the record reflect that the opposing witness has been glaring at me for 30 seconds and not answering my questions. It only took a couple of those on the record remarks before it became apparent to him that this was going to escalate up to a judge, and the impression that the judge would have of him would be less than favorable. So I think my message is that you just have to use whatever tools are available to you in the moment. Sometimes you have to escalate your crises up, right, and use more neutral people to resolve them. But take what's available to you in the moment. And the other takeaway message from that is that you shouldn't let anyone, regardless of their status in the community or their perceived arrogance or self-worth, don't let that let you feel diminished. Remain confident. Everyone in this room is experienced, educated. You've been in your positions a long time. Presumably you know what you're doing. Don't let people let you feel diminished.
Thank you so much. I don't know about all of you, but I feel like each of those answers had some very powerful messages. So, Brooke, if I start with you, for that outsider, conflict has impact on not just those involved in the conflict, but bystanders. So I think that is important for all of us to remember when we're managing through conflict, is there's others impacted. Brittany, I loved your point about the communications with that new hire and thinking about social media, because that has changed the landscape of how we deal with things today, and leaving that person feeling supported. When you leave an organization, you don't want to burn bridges because you never know where someone else, where you might run into them again in the community or in the business environment. And Marianne, talk about powerful message here, knowing your worth. I think we heard that all during the lunch keynote speaker, and using the tools in the moment and managing the crisis up. So thank you for sharing those. I'm going to pause and ask if there are any questions in the audience before I go on to the next question. Yes, right here.
Hi, my name is Kelly Langan. I'm with United Neighborhood Centers, and one of the reasons I came to this panel today is because I feel very confident when I need to address a conflict and I have time to kind of prepare for that. But when I have conflicts that show up in front of my face that I need to address in the moment, I tend to shut down, and I'm trying to find opportunities to practice responding in the moment. But I was wondering if you could give me any tips on where I can find opportunities to practice in a way that's not harmful to my staff, and that I can make sure that I'm supporting them, but also supporting myself, like we were talking about, Marianne.
So would you like to go ahead and start?
Sure. Thank you. That's a great question. Thank you very much. I think that knowing your tendencies on how to respond and being very self-aware is the first step. Then, taking opportunities to have discussions before it turns into a really escalated discussion is a next step to kind of get a little bit of practice. I always try to think when I'm having a difficult conversation, whether I can prepare for it or not, is what is my key message that I'm trying to get across, and how can I really formulate my words around what I'm really trying to say. And it's not always easy, and you're sometimes trying to have a difficult discussion with a lot of emotions going on. But if you really try to have that internal dialogue with yourself and keep going back to what is it that I'm looking to get out of this discussion, and use a lot of I statements. So I'm feeling like, we're not on the same page. What can we do to get there? Can we start with one thing that we agree on and kind of go from there? Or some things that I've learned over the years that have helped me get through some difficult discussions that I have not had the opportunity to prepare for.
Yeah, I would just add one thing to offer around what I call the pause. I think the nature of crises is that we think it always feels like a fire, and it feels urgent, and it often is urgent and fast moving. But sometimes it's maybe like a kitchen fire and not a house fire. We can just take a split second and see, what other perspectives do we need to have in the room, or who should we be listening to? I'm a huge believer that crisis communications is often information flowing in one direction from whoever's dealing with the crisis and whoever's kind of impacted by it. And I think there needs to be quite a lot of listening. And so there is often a really important space for, hey, let's bring together everyone who's impacted or might have a helpful perspective on this, because you don't always have to have all the answers yourselves, and what you hear from others can inform how you respond. And then I think the other piece is to do a debriefing process, a regular reflection. So if you can think of crises you've had in the past and reflect on, what do I think went really well? What do I think didn't go so well? Talk about that with other people and just make that a regular part of a culture of learning to reflect. I think, you kind of strengthen that muscle when it's not so urgent before a situation gets to your doorstep.
Kelly, that was a very good question. And I guess what I would say is that I'll revert to the things that I encounter when I'm in an arbitration setting and serving as the arbitrator. So you're describing a situation in which you're the manager, and presumably you have a problem, and we don't have conflict, right, unless there are at least two people involved. So I'll call them the managees. So when you're the manager and you have managees, sometimes the best approach is to divide and conquer, which is what we often do in arbitration. We split everybody up. We de-escalate the situation. As the manager, you don't want to imbue that situation with a lot of emotion. That will only make it worse, right? So you've got to be a calm manager. And then in dividing and conquering your managees, you're going to ensure that you give them a confidential environment where they have the ability to vent, and they've got to trust you so that they know that the information they're imparting will remain confidential. And you have to be thoughtful and non-judgmental too. And sometimes just setting up a construct like that and separating everybody and giving the situation a chance to diffuse, giving everybody what I'll call in my setting, in an arbitration setting, their proverbial day in court without actually being there, right? Sometimes that allows the situation to resolve itself. You want to create an environment where cooler heads will prevail.
I did see another question right in the next row, so I'm going to jump there.
So would you recommend, or would it be overkill, if you have some kind of a procedure in place for conflict resolution and employees would look, like should there be something in writing, or do you really think to deal with it case by case and don't put something in writing?
Thank you. I can give you my perspective. I think it's nice in the workplace for employees to have some formal outlet that they can use, hopefully as a last resort. This would be after there have been a couple of discussions. I would hope that if there's an issue, a peer-to-peer issue, that we're having a discussion amongst each other as an initial step to resolve whatever the conflict is. Anytime that I get an issue brought to me, I say, have you tried talking to the other person directly? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And if the answer is no, I would always suggest, well, maybe what could we start with as an initial discussion point directly? If that doesn't work, what's the next step? Going to a supervisor, someone in a leadership role, and from there, sometimes organizations need hotlines because things happen that shouldn't be happening in the workplace, and there needs to be some kind of formal outlet for employees to raise issues to a higher level, or some companies have philosophies on how they want conflict to be handled in the workplace. So I think that from a workplace perspective, there probably should be some formal instruction to employees. Okay, if there's something that's not able to be successfully handled directly through your own efforts, here's some formal outlet for you to have your concerns addressed. Marianne, did you want to?
Sure. So I guess what I would add to that is that it's important for those in the workplace to know the rules in advance. And I would go back and give that same instruction to people who are dealing with not just employees, but with children, for example. And I'll give you a little anecdotal story. So as my boys were growing up, I was a Cub Scout and a Weeblo Den leader forever, it seemed. My kids are born in each of 3 decades, so my kids like to make fun of me for having children in the 1980s, 1990s, and then 2001. So we were doing this forever, it seemed. And raising boys, as I mentioned, was fun, as you can imagine. So there was often conflict, and it was often physical conflict. You don't expect to see that in the workplace, but sometimes you do, I guess. But we had one rule with our kids and with our Cub Scouts when they would come to the meetings, because they would come to our house. And it was only one rule, and I made them remember it because I made them tell me the rule at the beginning of every meeting. And it was very simple. It was, don't touch. Don't touch. Simple, right? And I made them repeat that at the beginning of every meeting because touching caused 80% of the problems that we had with little boys. Touching other people's stuff caused another 10% of the problems, right? So if you don't touch, it solves 90% of your problems. So that was my one rule with kids. Now, when it comes to workplace encounters, it's really important to have a policy in place. And most businesses now are astute enough to have employee handbooks. And if you establish the rules in advance, and if you break these rules, here's what will happen, then no one can complain that they were mistreated at the back end, right? So have your employee handbook, and if you don't have one, I strongly encourage you to have one. Big businesses can't do without an employee handbook. It is a Bible. If you're going to terminate somebody, you better not do that unless it's for a good reason, usually a violation of the employee handbook. But as long as you have the rules in advance, then the process almost corrects itself or establishes itself. I think in the employment setting, your employment handbook is going to tell you that there is progressive discipline. So there will be a warning, then there will be a more severe form of discipline, and then finally, in some cases, termination. So that's really my best advice for how to deal with that sort of conflict in the workplace. Know the rules.
Going to pile on there. So from a workplace perspective, earlier today, if you were in the squirrel session, we talked about setting expectations and having clear rules of engagement. A lot of times it's that inner narrative where each person has a backstory playing in their mind. I think about a time where you're giving a presentation and someone in the back of the room starts looking at their watch or looking at their phone. All of a sudden, in your mind, they don't like the presentation, you didn't hit the right points, or maybe they were checking to see if their kids got home from school okay, right? So we all have the inner narrative. So I loved Take the Pause, and I love following the handbook because it does give clear outline and guidelines. And if we do take the pause and separate people, they can have time to work through what their inner narrative might have been versus the true facts of the situation. And it's okay if you're having a conversation and it gets heated, or you're working with people that are having a conflict, for them to take a break and walk away. Just because you start a conversation doesn't mean you need to end at that moment. You can say, I think it's getting escalated and we need to walk away and come back. Can you think about, and give them some homework. And if they have time to self-reflect, when you come back, it typically will be a better conversation. And if you know going into a conversation that it's going to be a conflict, prepare yourself to call out the pause card and say, we're going to walk away. It's okay. Sometimes I feel like as a woman, we feel like we have to solve it right then and there. We're the problem solvers. We're supposed to be fixing it. And we tend to put ourselves last and give in, where if we walked away, we would be able to recompose ourselves and bring ourselves back to the conversation. So just wanted to add that. Any other questions in the audience? Yes, right here.
Thank you for the question. I may not have a fully satisfying answer, but I'm going to answer on one level, and maybe others can also respond more directly. But it calls to mind for me, I think in situations like that, I think a lot about culture building and what that has to do with creating an environment where that actually heads off conflict and also makes it easier to deal with conflicts when they do crop up. So I think about, if we're thinking more holistically and not defining crisis communications so narrowly as something bad happens and then we want to respond to reduce the adverse outcomes, if we think of it as, okay, what can we do in advance, right? When we're building our culture, are we having regular one-on-ones between managers and their direct reports? Are we building rapport with people? Are we helping them feel that they're included, that their perspectives are valued? Or is there something amiss there where that person, for whatever reason, doesn't feel that they can share openly in the meeting? Are there power dynamics that have not been sort of named and identified and called out? Is the person who's running and facilitating the meeting really designing it in a way that maybe some people are just shy or they're internal processors. Some people like to brainstorm by writing out their ideas versus sharing them verbally. And sometimes there is something else, specifically going on in an instance. But I do think that, we can't think about, if we think about crisis in a silo and just about at the point of when things have reached a head and we need to deal with it, we'll miss the opportunity to kind of see the crisis as something that might be part and parcel of something off in our organizational or company culture, or something that could be improved there. So just as an additional perspective, but again, others might have more direct take on what to do in that situation specifically. Either of you?
Sure. So, just one thing to add, I think, is sometimes it's not easy to disagree in the room, and sometimes there have been times where I'm the only woman in a room and I don't agree with whatever is being said, and that's not an easy position to be in. And sometimes you might not know how to disagree in that setting in the workplace. And I would say if you're not sure what to say or how to say it, pause. Probably pause and find someone that you trust and say, hey, I'm looking for your feedback on how I might be able to approach this with the team in the workplace. And then you can maybe even do a little bit of a role play and address the situation the next day, or go back to those folks who were in the room and say, gosh, I've been thinking a lot about our meeting yesterday, and I have something that I'd like to add. So I think that that's a way that you can get some practice and really kind of prepare what you're going to say and think through it instead of doing it in that moment when you might not really be super prepared. I've done that before. I've asked for feedback on how I can do something, and then you go back to the discussion. And then the next time when you're sitting in the room and you have something to say, you might feel a little bit more prepared. Okay, now I'm going to speak up because I know what I want to say. I know how I'm going to say it. And I feel like I can do this. So.
Okay, thanks. The only thing I would add to that is that if you are the manager, remember we were talking about managers versus managees a few minutes ago. If you're the manager, there's nothing wrong with closing the deal. We close the deal in every other aspect of our lives, right? You terminate a marriage and there's a divorce decree, right? You separate somebody from employment and sometimes there's an exit interview or there's a termination letter or something along those lines. There's nothing wrong with using, for example, diplomatic social media. If you've resolved a conflict, you spent all this time resolving this conflict, right? Think about all the energy and time you put into that. You want to close the deal. So there's nothing wrong with diplomatically using social media, email, for example, and sending a pleasant email to the rest of the group and saying, I'm so glad we had a chance to sit down and talk about this yesterday. I'm so glad that this is how we resolved it. If you have any further questions or comments or you're concerned, come find me. You know where to reach me. I'm available for a telephone call. But it's really important that even when it comes to something as simple as managing emotions and conflict in the workplace, that you seal the deal.
Thank you. I think sealing the deal, right, closing it off and closing the loop with communication, whether you didn't get to bring something up or if someone is agreeing with you in the meeting and disagreeing after is to call it out. That's also managing conflict, is not shying away. So it's okay to approach someone if they're disagreeing after the meeting and say, did we miss something or did I not capture the thoughts and the outcome that we all agreed upon? So thank you. Next question, because I did see a few more hands. Okay, right here.
moment, but I want to give you an example of here's a way not to use written communication to resolve your conflict. First of all, we see emails pop up all the time in depositions. The contentious case I was just telling you about a moment ago, my clients were two gentlemen who were business partners, and one sent nasty emails about his partner during the course of trying to resolve a deal, and all of that came out during the litigation. So you can imagine the dynamic that creates. I like to tell people that if you're using email, just think that that email could be broadcast to the entire world. Whatever you put in writing could be broadcast to the entire world. But what I'm about to tell you about has nothing to do with the workplace. This was a family dispute, and I come from a large family. I'm one of 6 kids. And my brother and my sister-in-law were having a dispute, something to do about a family vacation. And my sister-in-law decided to write a letter to my brother and give him a piece of her mind. And she did. So my brother, who has no filter, writes a letter back. Before he did, he had his husband review the letter. And this is the way the letter began, even after it was edited. His first line, "First of all, I don't like you." Do you realize that you used the word "I" 19 times in your letter to me? That's how the letter began. So that's not how you resolve conflict, right? Now I'm going to turn it over to Brooke to tell you how you really should resolve conflict when you're using email.
Marianne, I feel like we need to hear the rest of that letter. Can you email it to me? That was such a good question. So developing those environments where employees feel safe and empowered happens over time. And it happens through developing relationships built on trust. And I found that the most successful leaders that I've seen have regular communications with their employees, and 4 out of 5 of those communications are very positive. Hey, I like what you did on this project. Maybe you can work with the team in sharing, how you got to this conclusion, and really offering those employees opportunities to develop relationships across the organization through positive feedback. Because when you do that 5th time that you need to talk to that employee could be a challenging discussion, or you might have to share something critical or have a difficult feedback discussion. And if you've had those other 4 positive discussions, giving them safe spaces to be creative, to develop relationships in the organization, that one time that you have to have a difficult discussion, it goes a little bit better than if the only time they see you or hear from you is, oh, here comes Brooke. I must be getting written up today. Right? Here she comes. She only shows up when there's bad news. So those safe spaces in the workplace take a lot of time, and it takes a lot of commitment from the leadership team. My organization talks a lot about culture development because we're a new company. We just started. And we talk a lot about it's every discussion, every day with every employee. It's not a pizza party on Tuesday and a company picnic in the summertime. It's every day. And when those interactions are consistent and you develop that base of trust with your people, then when they go into those rooms, they feel safe in expressing themselves because they know that you trust them. They know where they stand with you because you're giving them feedback, right? And they're going to have that safe space, but it takes time.
Yeah, +1 to all of that. I mentioned earlier one-on-ones. I think something we do across our organization is if you manage people, every single week you're having a 1-hour minimum check-in with that person, and there's a standing agenda. We update it. Both of us have ownership over updating the agenda, so it's not, the manager sets everything on the agenda. The direct report is also having input, and on my standing agendas I put in feedback for me. So every single week I want you to come prepared to give me feedback, whether that's positive, constructive, and I'm doing the same. So just normalizing that of this is what we're going to do every single week. And actually, again, it requires some preparation to the point of it does require commitment. In our case, we're 7 or 8 hours time difference. We're working across time zones. Sometimes that means you have to have a 7 a.m. Eastern time meeting, but it's that important. And when you see a CEO who's super busy and doing lots of external calls, prioritizing their one-on-one meetings with their direct reports at all different hours of the day, it sends a really strong message across the organization that we value building a culture that where people trust each other, where there are those safe spaces. So I think it definitely does come from leadership, but it's also something that everyone across the organization can practice.
Tag on for the email. I tend to have a rule, if you get to the third email, you better be picking up the phone, because if I get copied on a string where you're at the third point, there's going to be a problem, right? That's not meeting expectations. And then that helps kind of quell I'm just going to keep this email going, and it might take 3 weeks, and now there's lots of nastiness and misunderstanding. So I would definitely set some expectations. And then I just want to double click on your question about conflict. Sometimes it's not always the people that report to us that we might have conflict with, right? So it could be people that are outside of our line of authority, but we definitely can have influence. So again, I would say don't shy away from the conflict. Start with the end in mind and what your goal is, and think of how you can manage that conflict. It's really important. I know you talked about culture is also walking the talk, because sometimes in conflict you could be wrong, and we want to be that clean bowl that's ready to take the tea, that's ready to take the feedback. And if we're defensive as soon as we get the feedback, that's going to shut down the conversation. So I would just add on the rule about the email. And again, sometimes we're not always right. So be ready and willing to accept the feedback and do something about it, because then people will be more likely to resolve conflict with you and have trust and create that open culture. All right. Next question. Yes, right here. So I'd like to share an example, and then I'm going to turn it over to the panel. I was working on a diversity event for work, and I was really, really excited about it. And it was a little controversial at the time, and I needed to get a lot of approvals. And a peer, that was in charge of the whole month of diversity events was not on board. And I thought that they were on board during our conversations, but found that they weren't championing it in other conversations. And I remember vividly walking into my mentor at the time. They weren't my boss. I walked into their room. I shut the door. I said a few expletives and said, I'm not working with them anymore. I'm just going to pick things that I don't have to work with this person. And she listened and didn't try to take the nail out of my head. She let me go on for a few minutes. And then she said, now, do you think that's realistic? And I thought about it and what this person's role was, and it wasn't realistic. And so I had to change my mindset, because I had some preconceived notions about what powered this person. And I said, I'm going to just set up an informational conversation, because even though we worked together, we weren't super close. We were, I would say we were parallel, not overlapping. And I set up time and just started to get to know them. Would I say we totally vibed and they're on my board of directors? No. But it did give me a little bit more insight into what makes them tick, and made me a little bit more comfortable in calling them out when I disagreed, because I felt like I knew a better path to present the conversation. And then I also looked to get them on board prior to conversation. conversations. So it would get buy-in and get them connected to the idea or the commitment we were making so that they were as invested as I was. It didn't always work out 100%, right? So I would be lying if I said it was, we were dancing and there was unicorns and rainbows, right? But it made it more manageable where I at least knew a better way to approach the conversation. So I'll turn it over to you, ladies.
So I'll share an experience as well. I had a peer HR person a few years ago who was very competitive, and it felt like he was always trying to one-up me, quite frankly, throw me under the bus sometimes. And what I found, and it was incredibly challenging because my instinct is to get very emotional. I cannot believe you just threw me under the bus. And then I, over time, realized what he's doing is a reflection of him and has nothing to do with me. So when I started having some self-talk and I decided, you know what? I'm going to let him over there acting a fool, trying to throw me under the bus, and I'm going to go about my day and focus on the things that are my responsibility and in my control, because I had no control over how he was acting. And when I started to kind of put that to the side, and sure, we had to work together and we had to maintain a professional working relationship, I'm like, okay, here are my goals. And I'm going to do everything that I'm going to do to hit my goals. And, if those kinds of behaviors are going on around me, I'm going to do my best to stay focused on what I'm responsible for and the things that I can control. And that's not easy always because it feels so personal when someone in your workspace, and we spend so much time with these people, are taking those shots against you. And so I would say, to add to the other feedback, focus on what's in your scope of control. And the way that someone else is acting is a reflection of them. And the way you respond to it is a reflection of you.
I'll give an example as well. A couple of years back, I was reporting to someone. I was a manager in our organization. I was reporting to a director who reported to our CEO. And the decision was made through a series of conversations that I would be moved out from under that person, be promoted to director, and have my own sort of standalone department reporting to the CEO. So my former boss did not take that well. She wasn't too excited. It meant for her that her scope was being effectively reduced, that the number of direct reports she had was reduced by a couple. And so it was a difficult time. And we had a pretty good rapport as I had been reporting to her, but I think she had the sense that I was having separate conversations that she wasn't involved in, which was not the case, but it was moving very quickly. So there weren't too many opportunities to actually set things right. So one of the things I did was, she was at that point effectively a peer. We were both directors, and there wasn't necessarily a protocol around we need to be having regular touch bases, and we weren't clear on where we'd be overlapping on things. But I just set up, okay, we're going to have regular bi-weekly check-ins, and it was super one-sided initially. I was the only person scheduling it, the only person adding to the agenda. I would show up, sometimes she wouldn't be there, and I would just give her the benefit of the doubt kind of over and over, and she was 5 minutes late, 10 minutes late. Instead of reading into that, oh, she really doesn't want to be here, which was probably true, I was, oh, okay, maybe something came up. And we did that consistently enough that it got to a point where we were in regular communication and have now have a good working relationship. So there are areas where we're clearly collaborating. And I won't say that there are no unicorns. It is sort of just, it is what it is, but it's not a negative drain on either of our work. And sometimes I think that's the best outcome. So, sometimes it's just adjusting your expectations and saying we have to work together productively. So how do we get there?
I'm just going to do a quick time check. Okay. All right. So we are going to wrap up. Is there any last parting pieces of advice you'd like to give?
Yes, and that is that, we've seen in the last couple of months some fine examples of how not to address conflict management. Think, for example, of Will Smith and the Oscars. think of the social media, maybe Facebook posts, or maybe you saw it on the news of Mike Tyson on the airplane this past week, right? Sometimes just having those are great reminders about how not to behave, whether it's in the workplace, or it's on an airplane, or it's in a social setting. And so, I mean, I would leave you with that. Let's take whatever you can out of those really bad examples. And, sometimes that allows us just to reinforce conflict management. And something that someone said, by the way, earlier today, and I think it was you, Paula McCary, you're in the audience somewhere, I don't know where you were, but the point is, when we were talking about conflict management, we have to start dealing with these issues with our toddlers. Because if we wait until we're employees, it's far too late, right? So we all have a job as parents, as spouses, as teachers, of community members, as Cub Scout leaders, Girl Scout leaders. Hats off to the speaker this morning who talked about her role with the Girl Scouts. We have responsibilities to teach our kids from the age of toddlers on up how to resolve conflict effectively so we're not in this situation, 10, 20 years from now.
I think that's a perfect way to end because I think we're at time. So thank you, everyone, for your participation, and thank you to the panel.